Raising the Conversation, a podcast by the MacRae Centre for Faith and Culture at Acadia Divinity College, with your host Joel Murphy, facilitator of trend research and analysis here at the MacRae Centre.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Raising the Conversation podcast. I'm excited, as I always am, for these conversations. And today we have Reverend Dr. Jesse Zink, who is the principal of the Montreal Diocesan Theological College and canon theologian in the Diocese of Montreal. Sorry if I didn't get that right. So in those roles, he teaches at McGill University and the Montreal School of Theology Consortium, while also relating broadly to churches in Canada and in the United States. His latest book, which I have read and thoroughly enjoyed, was Faithful, Hopeful, and Creative: 15 Theses for Christian Witness in a Crisis-Shaped World. And that was released in the fall of 2024. Jesse and I have had some interaction together. We've done some work together, and I had the privilege of being in Montreal with him and some of his colleagues. And I'm really glad that you're able to join us and have this conversation today, Jesse.
Thanks so much. And thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So maybe we'll just hop right into it. And I know, you're a theologian, you're an author, you think about this, but you're also an educator. And I think, based on my experience, one of the things I really appreciate about you is you have a pastoral heart. And so this season, we're thinking and considering what it means about futures thinking and why it's important. And so the first question is, why do you think it's important for Christian leaders today to pay attention to the future? And how has that shaped your own leadership or imagination and all the various roles that you hold?
It's a good question. And certainly being oriented towards the future is a significant part of pastoral ministry. I think about this, I guess, in a couple of different ways. And one exercise I have my students do is, we draw a timeline on the board, right? And so we say, let's say that this is a timeline of God's action in history, right? And on one end of the timeline, we've got, creation. We've got the stories of the people of God in the Hebrew Scriptures. We've got the Christ event, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have the history of the church, the New Testament church, and onward to our own time. And in God's action, on God's timeline, that action continues well into the future as well. And part of what I have students consider is, what kind of words would you use to describe that future action? What is the vision of God's final consummating actions? We talk about abundant life. We talk about reconciliation, right relationship, the restoration of wholeness, the word shalom, for instance, right? So that's one way of thinking about the future of God's action in the world. But then I say, okay, let's do another timeline. And let's say it's not God's action in the world, but it's your congregation's timeline in the world, right? What's their past like? If they're like an Anglican church or United Church that I spend time with, or Baptist churches in the Maritimes, for instance, many of them have histories that go back many generations, and many of them know that history, right? And many of them look back at that past. They might look back a generation or two generations, and they say, "Oh, do you remember when our Sunday schools were full? Or do you remember when we had those great, Advent services and great parties afterwards? Or do you remember when Father so-and-so was here and wasn't the church just flourishing now?" And then they think about their present and they feel sort of sense of diminishment. And then if they look to the future at all, many churches are concerned about the future, right? For all the kinds of reasons that we probably don't need to rehearse right here, but for me it was summarized by a student of mine when I asked them this question. I said, what's your congregation think about the future? And they said, it's like that movie, it ends with us, right? Like they're just sort of holding on. People in that congregation felt like they were the last generation. It's not uncommon to hear some people in church say, well, as long as this church is around for my funeral, then that's it, right? So when you compare the future of God's action and the language we might use to describe that, and you compare that with the language of how people in their own congregations are thinking about their future, there's a real divergence there. And then the third and final timeline here is okay, let's think about the timeline that people in society are thinking about, right? and this could be a broader exercise, but let's just look to the future. Many people, and I work here in Montreal, I work with a lot of university students, a lot of young people have a lot of great concern about the future, whether
Mm.
that's tied to climate change, whether that's tied to a lack of economic opportunity that they feel. Am I ever going to be able to afford a house, for instance? People say to me, older people in churches I've met say, all my life I've looked forward to having grandchildren. And now my kids have told me they're not going to have children. And I feel like I've lost my future in some way, right?
Mm.
And so the purpose of this exercise, and you could expand this, in various ways, is to say thinking about the future is important. We're all sort of thinking about the future implicitly or explicitly, and how we think about the future really colors how we relate to our present right now. And so if people are feeling nervous, uncertain, afraid, angry, about what the future might hold, whether for their church congregation or for just their future as a human being in a thriving human society, uh, that's going to affect how they behave now. And so, now, this is a long answer. I'll bring it in for a landing here by saying this. The exercise that I like to do with my students is say, okay, so your job as pastoral minister, as a pastoral leader, is to think about how you can work with your community to help them understand that they're on a timeline, not just of this particular congregation in this particular place, but they're on a timeline that includes all of God's action throughout the whole scope of history, and that action definitely has a future. And because it has a future, that's going to affect and change and shape how we're in ministry right now.
I love that. I think there's so much there's so much wisdom in that, right? Because you're hitting on this idea of how we view the future, how we think about the future is going to inform how we respond in the present, right? It's going to shape, and that is intimately connected to our, I think, a level of theology or our belief. And so, like, when you think about scripture or theological perspectives, like, what of those have framed, like, and I think you're already, it's beginning to allude to it, right? Like, how is that scripture, what scripture theological frames have shaped your thinking about the future, even kind of building off of what you were talking about in terms of these activities?
So, I mean, theologically, and I say this with students, we're talking about the Christian discipline of eschatology, which is a word that I say you might not want to drop in a sermon, or at least not like your first sermon in your congregation. But there are other ways of thinking about that. And eschatology is just, I think, precisely this, thinking about God's timeline of action in the world. To say that God has acted in the past. I think that's a pretty uncontroversial statement for Christians. God is acting right now in the present. Jesus sends the Spirit to be with us. And God will act in the future as well. And that future action is consistent and congruent with everything we know about how God has acted, right? And so I take great hope. We're recording this, in the season of Advent when we read lots of eschatological passages. And I take hope from passages like the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, right? Like that is a future-oriented passage that says, hey, look, there were once people who were walking in darkness and they will see a great light. God has acted in this way, and God continues to act in this way. And I think sometimes, certainly in the kind of mainline Protestant traditions that I spend my time in, we get a little hesitant around eschatology. Partly because we feel it's been captured by, certain interpretations that reduce it entirely to like, the rapture. And I actually think there's just this incredible vision throughout the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament. And one of my lessons or assignments for students is to say, you you think about this and describe for me what is the goal of God's action in the world. What language would you use to describe that? And there's great and varied language. I named some of it earlier. God acts for reconciled relationship. God acts for shalom in the world. Again, we can make a long list, and students approach this in different ways. But the important thing is how we think about the future is going to affect how we live in our in ministry, how we live in our in ministry now.
So I'm gonna I want to ask like a kind of a follow-up question about that, because I think, which we didn't talk about, so you can pass it if you want, but like, I think a lot of the time, particularly for Christian leaders or Christian like Christ followers, there's a struggle when thinking about the future, and I think we can lean to this space of like we don't have to worry about it, right? God takes care of the lilies and the bird. Like why do you not care about what? And I feel like there's a tension for some folks around. Well, like I just need to believe and trust, and then the future will take care of itself, which inherently I don't think is necessarily wrong, but I feel like it doesn't capture fully kind of what you were articulating in terms of what this like what the kind of the robustness of what eschatological perspectives can offer.
Yeah, that's a I think that's I agree with that diagnosis, like, oh well, this is like too big for me, the timeline of God's action from, the Garden of Eden to me into the future. Like what can I possibly, do with that? So how would I answer that question? I think that part of the reason it's important is that, um, well, you use the word faith, right? Like I just need to have my faith now, and faith is a great, obviously one of the great cardinal virtues, along with love. But the third part of that triad is hope, and hope is the archetypal eschatological virtue. I don't know, that's a lot of words with a lot of syllables there, but hope is all about the future, and Christians have hope because we believe God is acting not just in the past, not just in the present, but also in the future. And in the world that we live in today, right now, hope can feel like it's in very short supply. And people are looking for that. The great anxieties and concerns that many of us are feeling, both about the churches, which we know and love, but also, frankly, just about the broader world, mean many people feel a sense of hopelessness. And and that is part of the pastoral challenge that we have today, is about being people of hope. And we can't be people of hope without thinking about some sense of the horizon, of some sense of what God is doing in the world.
I love that. I love that. That's yeah. Hmm. Uh, That's yeah. I feel like there's a grounding in that in terms of like as people of hope being able to then it's almost like a recognition of like as we look to if you're a hopeful, then you're naturally going to be looking to what's coming. You're naturally going to have that future orientation, because you're hopeful about something to come. That's marvelous. Yeah, I guess the next question was related to kind of a little bit more in terms of kind of, could you share a practice or a moment or experience where, and you've kind of articulated kind of this timeline in your course, so maybe that's the example, but an example where engaging in future helped you or your community or your school or your students see something new or take a meaningful step forward in terms of, as you engage in this process, what the next thing could be.
Uh, so, uh, I'm not engaged in daily pastoral ministry in congregations. It's certainly pastoral ministry with students. But as you said at the outset, I work with and relate to a lot of churches, and you know, what I've been impressed by, um, is congregations that are coming to, we can call them inflection points in their relationship with their buildings and the property they own, for instance. Uh, and and certainly here in Quebec, in Montreal, we have lots of congregations who've been through, conversations like, well, what are we going to do with this building? Can we continue to sustain it? And I think there's one way of saying, if we can't afford to pay for this building, then we've failed, right? Uh, and therefore, let's sell the building and let's all just go off in failure. Maybe some of us will join a nearby congregation if there is one, but many people don't, partly because feeling like a failure is not a great feeling. Um, and if you go to another church, you just feel like they've succeeded and you haven't. And that, I think, actually fits in with what I'm trying to say here, because their understanding of what church is about and what they've been taught to think church is about, and that the sole purpose of God's action in the world basically is sustaining them in this building, right? With, we should add, the other piece of this is sort of like a full-time, compensated, professionally trained, seminary educated clergy person, right? And if we can't afford those things, then we've failed, might as well shut down.
Mm.
I'd say where I've been impressed is congregations that resist that and say, okay, we can't afford this building anymore, uh, or we can't afford a full-time person anymore. We can't afford anybody, or perhaps there's nobody out there who wants to come be our minister in this congregation. Uh, but that doesn't mean we've failed.
Mm.
And I think these congregations are the ones that have a healthy sense of God's action in the world and how that's manifest in the church. And so I can think of congregations that have sold their buildings, uh, sold them to other churches, but arranged to rent back the space for part of the time. And that's freed them from the burden of having to manage the building and freed them up for a whole lot of other things that perhaps they weren't able to do or engage in beforehand.
Mm.
I think I can think of other congregations that have said, okay, we're done with this building, but we're still going to meet regularly and we're going to meet in somebody's house. Or we're going to take responsibility ourselves without any clergy for leading worship. We're going to look for resources to help do that. And those are congregations that I think, as I say, have a broad understanding of how God continues to act through the vehicle of God's people gathered together in scripture and prayer and worship and song and sacrament, uh, and are therefore able to continue their life together as witnesses to the way of Jesus, because of this vision of how God is acting in the world.
Right. I love that. And I think I got to stop saying that over and over again. I really appreciate that because it's emphasizing that there's, when we think about it's about how we approach what's happening around us to be able to imagine that future. And I think that is, it can be hard when you're in moments of potential crisis where we can't afford this building, we right, and that shame, or like we failed, and then that can stymie or cause this sense of like a lack of imagination and a lack of hope. Um,
And it goes back to that, like the sort of like differing timelines, right? Like to say that the timeline of this congregation is one thing, but there's actually a broader timeline of God's horizon of action in this world. And let's think about how we're part of that rather than the timeline of this particular group of people in this place meeting in this building, which seems to be coming to an end, but the timeline of God's action is not coming to an end.
which actually like to that statement feels like it actually it answers the final question that I wanted to ask you, which is about when you think about the future, what gives you hope, and then what encouragement would you offer leaders who feel uncertain about what lies ahead? I feel like that statement of understanding the bigger picture and that you're part of this bigger redemptive narrative actually can provide that. But I would be curious if there's other pieces other than, of course, like I really appreciated your book and how it provides a hopeful perspective and be able to pull these things apart in terms of the 15 theses of what's happening around us. But are there other elements, what gives you hope or what you would want to encourage, how you would want to encourage others?
I, I mean, ultimately, that question, when thinking about the future, what gives me hope, has, I think, uh, a pretty short answer. And that answer is, what gives me hope is the revelation of the God made known in Jesus Christ yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, I can say a lot more about that, but ultimately, I feel like that's the starting point, and that's the cornerstone on which everything else is being built. So what I would say is in terms of giving encouragement to other people, um, I think there are a couple of things that or practices that help me remember what hope looks like when lived in a community. And so the first thing I would say is, having some sense of what is coming in the future. And, I like to envision the vision I like comes from the book of Revelation, where all of these people, hundreds of thousands of people from every tongue and language and tribe and nation are gathered together around the throne praising God. This vision of a reconciled community together worshiping God, reconciled with one another. Uh, and so I think, therefore, the church is called to live like that as much as we can in anticipation of what is to come. Our sense of what the future is like leads us to live and minister in certain ways now in anticipation of the future. Um, you know, one of my favorite movies, and I'm not gonna like claim any great cultural awareness here by saying this, is the 2003 movie Pirates of the Caribbean, starring Johnny Depp. And if you have seen that movie, this does not spoil the end of the movie, but so Johnny Depp plays this rather hapless pirate who, for most of the movie, is trying to, this is just one plot strand among many, trying to get back his beloved pirate ship. And finally, at the end of the movie, he's standing on his beloved pirate ship at the wheel, and he looks out at the horizon of the Caribbean and he says, "Now bring me that horizon." And
Mhm.
I think that is a description of what Christian ministry is all about. We look at the horizon, we see what we know God is working towards in the future, and then we say, we're going to bring it forward as much as we can, knowing we're broken and fallible and imperfect people. And we're going to bring that forward right now and offer a foretaste in anticipation of what is to come. And and so, for me, I've just said that my vision of that horizon is this vision of reconciled community across lines of difference, worshiping God. Well, we're going to try to live like that now. We're going to think about what that means, particularly here in Montreal, but across Canada, about how we integrate people from newcomers to Canada and many different people from many different backgrounds, speaking many different languages, among other things. We're going to think about how all that works and how that shapes our life of prayer together and worship together and Bible study and song
Mhm.
and all sorts of other things. So that idea of bring me that horizon, I think is Johnny Depp making a very deeply eschatologically profound statement.
I
Um, yeah, so you can use that line. Don't worry, I'll get around to writing it down sometime. But I think maybe the last thing I would just say is about encouragement to people who feel uncertain about what lies ahead, is that there's one way of reading the Bible and looking back and seeing all these heroes of the faith who, were like successful people who made all the right decisions. But I love, and again, here we are in Advent, to just like sit myself there and imagine myself being like Mary or Joseph or Zachariah, the father of John the Baptist, all these people who we look back on and be like, what great people they were, which is true. Uh, but imagine yourself in that moment, before the angel shows up and tells you you're going to bear God's son, or before that moment when you've been working for so long and you're going to say you're told that you're going to become the father of John the Baptist. Imagine what it was like to live under Roman occupation, under this client king, great economic change taking place. Uh, and it's not like they had all the answers,
Mhm.
right? Uh, and I take a lot of hope from imagining myself in that position. And then when I imagine myself in that position and I read, the song that Zachariah sings when he cradles his newborn son, John the Baptist, in his arms for the first time and says, praises not only John the Baptist, like, what a great boy you are. Every father feels that way about their newborn son. But he looks backward all the way to Abraham, to what God has done. And he
Mm,
looks forward as well. He says, look, John, you're going to be the forerunner of this other guy who's going to be like the dawn from on high breaking upon us to shine, on our death, the day spring on from on high. This beautiful, beautiful language. Uh, Imagine yourself in that position, and Zechariah has this like incredible eschatological perspective on things, and it gives him hope for the moment that he's living in. And likewise, thinking about Mary singing the Magnificat, and saying, "Let it be to me according to your will." And what they do, what all of those people do, and ultimately this is what Jesus does as well, is that they have this vision of the future, but then they commit to one another, right?
mm.
Like they commit to each other. Mary goes right off and sees Elizabeth, for instance, right? They commit to each other, uh, and they form these communities, ultimately the kind of community Jesus forms as well with his followers, that live this rich life of mutuality, relationship, of sharing things in common, and say, we don't know what's coming, but we're going to live like this now because we know God is still acting, and it's going to look something like this in the future.
I think that's a beautiful, beautiful conclusion around, as we even think about the future, we're doing it together, and that we can't move into whatever, or as we look to that horizon, we have to move towards it together and for one another, and having Jesus at the core of that. I think that's remarkable. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your, I think, the depth of insight, but also just the honesty and the earnesty behind it, I feel is, and it's encouraging. I'm encouraged. I hope it's encouraging for others, but also I think it offers us great perspective and insights around how to continue to move into this space and in this context that is so tumultuous. So thank you very much.
Can I add one final piece here,
Yeah, absolutely.
which is to, first of all, thank you for the opportunity and the work that you're doing, and I think really orienting us towards the future is so important. You mentioned at the outset my recent book, The Faithful, Creative, Hopeful: 15 Theses for Christians in a Crisis-Shaped World. And a lot of the material about eschatology and hope comes from that book, although not the Johnny Depp piece. That's new
It's new
material,
material.
podcast exclusive. But what I wanted to say is that that book, as you so kindly noted, was written for pastoral ministry specifically. And there's a study guide that goes along with it. So if you go to jessezink.com, very bare bones website, you can find a downloadable PDF study guide, which a lot of people have used to read that book in congregations, and it gives you some discussion questions and cheat sheets on how to read it. So if that's useful to your listeners, I'd be grateful if you can draw some attention to that.
Amazing. Yeah, no, we will put that in the, however we put links into places, we will do that, because that's,
Thank
I
you so
think I
much.
really enjoyed the book. It was very accessible, and yeah, having that guide to be able to engage with it deeper is awesome. So we will do that, and thank you again. I really appreciate this time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.